So recently I've been reciting some from the Lankavatara Sutra. Actually, this is the Red Pine translation. I previously had recited on an unabridged basis the entire Suzuki translation. But certainly in either translation, I think you see this phrase called neither existence nor non-existence is what the Buddha preaches. And in some ways, I wondered whether that's not similar to the idea of the middle path that Sakyamuni was said to have been found, when basically he discovered that the path to enlightenment, so to speak, was neither in the direction of extreme asceticism or in the direction of indulgence. So this middle path concept I have found to be very useful in my life, and also in input that I have given to others regarding issues that they may be confronting. And in reflecting upon this further as it relates to my Pure Land Buddhist identification, it occurred to me that that may be also a way to think about the issue of whether or not the Pure Land and Amida Buddha are literally true in terms of the way they're described in the Sukhavati Sutras, or whether it is more purely symbolic. And you see these two different interpretations floating around within the sanghas within the Pure Land tradition, within Shin Buddhism or Pure Land Buddhism. Now, it so happens that I've been in correspondence with a leader within the Buddhist Churches of America, and he was, by way of sort of giving me guidance and stimulating questions in my mind that he felt would perhaps help me clarify my own stance, was asking me about my position with regard to the question of a more non-traditional, which would be a metaphorical or a symbolic interpretation of Jodo Shinshu or Shin Buddhism, versus a more literal kind of interpretation. So I formulated a response for him, and while I will not give the specifics that pertain exactly to this individual, I want to share some of the content of the draft of something I wrote up to help clarify for him and for myself what are my beliefs and ideas with regard to this question. Because again, some people take one extreme or the other, and this may be a case where neither literal nor symbolic, or neither existence nor non-existence in the sense of the broader Mahayana teaching of the Lankavatara may be appropriate and applicable here. So I said to this individual, I've been aware for some time that the issue of, quote, literal view or literal interpretation versus non-traditional, metaphorical or symbolic interpretation is, to say the least, a significant issue within Jodo Shinshu circles. I went on to say that as I reflected, it occurred to me that perhaps my position can be characterized as the middle path or middle way, to use the framework of what Buddha Sakyamuni discovered as a wise method to address many issues that we face on the spiritual path and in our everyday lives. This is an approach that I have found to be meaningful and helpful many times in my personal life, as well as in my career as a clinical psychologist and hospital administrator. I shall try to describe what I mean by this and how I came to such a perspective by sharing a bit of detail regarding my personal history and my encounter with the Buddha Dharma. My historical starting point, as is the case with many, and as the historical Buddha highlighted in his teaching of the First Noble Truth, was suffering. Without getting into detail, I will share that I grew up in circumstances that resulted in a good deal of anxiety and a drive toward perfectionism. This was adaptive as I made rapid progress through college and graduate school, and then moved on into the world of community mental health. There, I took on clinical leadership roles and enjoyed much success. But by the age of 30, I longed for an opportunity for greater freedom from externally determined requirements and expectations for my professional activity, so I went into private practice. Even though my financial situation was secure at that point, my anxiety level was heightened by the overall uncertainty of the novel situation. It was in that circumstance, and outside the context of any religious belief system whatsoever, that I experienced what I have variously referred to as a conversion experience, or spiritual awakening, or experience of non-dual consciousness. This experience, which was characterized by a wonderful freedom from anxiety, was continuous over time and not a mere transitory one. As a result, I naturally sought to understand it better. This led me to a study of various spiritual and religious and particularly mystical traditions. In doing so, I could see the common threads among the major approaches, but over time I came to a conviction that Buddhism in general, and Mahayana Buddhism in particular, seemed superior. I was actually quite amazed that there existed writings, such as the Great Vehicle Sutras, within this tradition, which not only described this experience that was beyond words, but which also laid out a path toward fulfillment of it for those interested in making the journey. That was the Bodhisattva path. I actually tried to change my life to be more consistent with the Bodhisattva path. These efforts taught me how limited my capabilities were in comparison to the lofty descriptions of bodhisattvas in the sutras. Meanwhile, I was getting deeply immersed in the Threefold Lotus Sutra, which I had the good fortune to study with an older woman who lived in my community. She was a Pure Land Buddhist, and introduced me to that Easy Path tradition. I changed my life further to put an emphasis on devotional practices, including fairly constant mental repetition of the Nembutsu. This led me to the insight that, in Shin Buddhist terms, it was Amida who called me, not the other way around. At the earlier point in time when the awakening experience hit, I did have a perception that a force other than me was in operation, but I apparently had to exercise my ego in various ways before I was able to truly accept that conclusion. In any case, once I settled into a mode of confident entrusting, I was able to get back into a more normal lifestyle of raising a family and working a regular job. All of this is a preamble to answering the question, why did I choose Shin Buddhism as a way to understand and express my awakening experience? And how do I conceptualize Amida and the Pure Land from the standpoint of literal fact versus symbol? There are many who have had an experience of non-dual consciousness, who characterize their experience within a mainstream religion such as Christianity or Judaism or Islam, while many characterize the experience in various idiosyncratic ways. In contrast to the latter, I deliberately wanted to identify with an established religious tradition. I figured that if anyone else was to learn by my experience, I wanted them to be able to understand it in a traditional framework. Clearly, Buddhism met that criterion. Further, I did not want to promulgate an understanding that would exclude anyone who did not have the ability to withdraw from the householder life into some kind of a monastic setting. That meant framing my experience within the Easy Path school. Shinran's interpretation of the 18th vow and the experience of shinjin perfectly met that criterion. I love the fact that Jodo Shinshu is, as Dr. Al Bloom has noted, a system of pure grace. An additional attraction of Shin Buddhism was, for me, that it is a conceptual framework which is rooted in the profound teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. This is what I think Shinran was trying to demonstrate in his masterwork, Kyogao Shinsho. I would like to use this embeddedness of Shinshu within the broader Great Vehicle teachings as a springboard to address the question regarding my views as to the more literal versus the more metaphorical interpretation of Shin doctrine. As is expressed and reiterated over and over in the Mahayana scriptures, particularly within the Prajnaparamita literature, a basic truism is that the nature of reality is non-dual. The problem for us human beings, however, is that our thinking mind operates in a dualistic fashion. This is very helpful for solving problems in the mundane conventional world, but it handicaps us when we seek to know the true nature of things. As it says in the second chapter of the Innumerable Meanings Sutra, our tendency to break the world down into this versus that keeps us in the dark as far as realizing the Buddha knowledge. That ignorance is the fundamental source of our suffering and is the most basic of the three poisons of ignorance, greed, and aversion. The Buddha's problem, as framed in the sutras, since he wanted to help beings attain relief from suffering, or even to become enlightened to the realization that all things are unborn, was to determine how to communicate in a way that people would understand and accept his teachings. Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra gives the answer. He uses upaya, or expedient, skillful, tactful means. I am grateful to those who composed the sutras for having elaborated the dynamics of that solution, such as in the parables of the lotus, so that we could better understand why the Buddha provided such a broad array of teachings, including those associated with an easy path. To my mind, all religious doctrines or ways of describing non-dual consciousness in verbal terms are, by definition, skillful means. They are all merely a finger pointing at the moon. The implication is that if I were pushed, I would have to acknowledge that I do not adhere to Shin doctrine as literally true. Nor, for example, is the teaching of sunyata or emptiness in the Diamond Sutra literally true. The truth is that there is neither existence nor non-existence. Let me here quote the Lankavatara Sutra in Chapter 3 of Suzuki's translation, verses 115 to 117, which I happen to be reciting as part of my effort to slog through the Sagathakam. Quote, "The physician varies his treatment according to diseases, though there is no difference in the principle of healing. The difference comes from varieties of diseases. In like manner, in order to save generations of beings from their disease of passions with which they are ill, I teach people with my doctrines, knowing the power of their senses. My doctrine does not vary, but the passions and powers are differentiated. There is just one vehicle. Auspicious is the Eightfold Path." Close quote. Just to stay in the weeds for a moment, the Lanka implicitly criticizes the earlier form of Buddhism, which represents the path of the Shravakas. But in this passage, the Buddha is saying the Eightfold Path is good. Why? Because it is a teaching to which his disciples can relate at their level of spiritual development, and it is certainly an efficacious teaching with respect to the relationship between clinging and dukkha. The Lotus says the same thing, although those who cling to the teaching in a literal fashion are not willing to go beyond it, and they leave the assembly before the Buddha gives his profound one-vehicle message. While teachings such as the Four Noble Truths have great value, those earlier doctrines are not the ultimate teaching. Even the Mahayana written texts are not ultimate teaching. Ultimate teaching is what the Lanka calls the inner realization of noble wisdom. It is an experience. It is the experience of wisdom, or prajna, non-dual consciousness, or perhaps what we think of in Shin terms as the experience of shinjin. The experience of prajna is literally inconceivable, not able to be expressed in verbal concepts, though as humans we want and need a conceptual framework to think about our experience because we are thinking beings. But again, thinking is inherently dualistic and thus cannot fully express the ultimate truth. Well, I am going on just to say that while I do not take Jodo Shinshu doctrine literally, I nevertheless travel the easy path because, like almost all others in this era, so far distant from the presence of the Nirmanakaya Buddha, it is the only path feasible for me. If most Shin Buddhists adopt a literal interpretation, that is understandable, and I see no problem with that at all, so long as they do not harshly criticize those who do not. Now, to the harder part of the question. In what sense is Amida real? And in what sense is my destiny to be reborn in the Pure Land real? As for this narrative, which serves as the basis for doctrine in Jodo Shinshu, I like the term mythopoetic, which, as I recall, was used by Harold Stewart. While Shinran's interpretation of the story of Dharmakara Bosatsu is not real in a literal sense, it is true. It is true in that it resonates with our human experience. It is not just a wish fulfillment, but rather is a conceptual framework that addresses some fundamental psychological and emotional dynamics within our human mind and heart, as well as the fundamental and real underlying broader network of interrelationships and interconnectedness of which we are a part, as is stated so poetically and extensively in the Avatamsaka Sutra. This is hard to understand and hard to explain, so I will just babble on a bit. I think that one of the two key dynamics that our faith tradition addresses is the importance of each individual recognizing his or her gross limitations. As the scriptures teach, we have these limitations due to such factors as passions, clinging, habit energy, ego. As Trungpa within the Tibetan tradition has noted, ego in particular really does not want to give up the illusion of a separate self. And yet, no self is one of the three true aspects of reality according to Buddhist doctrine, along with suffering and impermanence. Oh, and speaking of impermanence, we definitely do not want to accept the implications of that aspect of reality, especially as it relates to our own death. Even though impermanence is more easily understood than no self, many of these handicaps come back to our self-consciousness and dualistic thinking mind, which is an aspect of our organic brain cognitive makeup. Again, this is a great boon to our survival as a species, but gets in the way of experience anuttara samyak sambodhi. Shinran understood his limitations. He knew he could not accomplish the Tendai ideal on Mount High. It was in the context of his experience of failure that his ego was pierced enough to be open to the impact of what I considered to be the second element in the recipe for shinjin, namely acknowledgement of and reliance upon other power. And of course, in his culture, the Pure Land Path tradition had been percolating for hundreds of years. We owe him a great debt of gratitude for so eloquently describing the evolution of the tradition via his teaching regarding the lineage of patriarchs. In any case, with the emergence of these two factors, an acute and perhaps painful awareness of limitations and personal failure, along with an appeal of another power that embodies the ideal of perfection that is beyond human capacity, the seed of Buddha nature can be thus revealed in the form of an entrusting heart. This is my basic understanding of shinjin, or religious faith. And this experience, in ways that are inconceivable to us, somehow correlates with or mirrors what is ultimately true and real. Namo Mita Boots. Namo Mita Boots. Namo Mita Boots.